Hello everybody, hope you're doing okay. Now we've got the Abingdon Marathon coming up on Sunday. We've got Andy, the FOD runner, running in it. And also we've got Dawn Broom. Both of those runners have run in it before. This time Dawn's running for the Welsh Masters. And next weekend we've got the Frankfurt Marathon. So I thought it would also feature Robin from Road to Trail, who's actually coached by Andy. And here he is with his race shoes, the Fast Stars, in some sort of glorified towpath. So as usual, what we'll do is have a look at their training and then see what sort of prospects we got for each of the runners. Okay, so as usual, I've looked at the training here for the three runners for the 14 weeks prior to the race, for their respective races, that is. So Abingdon is coming up on the Sunday and Frankfurt is the following Sunday. So there's a slight offset here. But what I also do is not count the last week as the taper week. So these statistics are based on the 13 weeks just to provide consistency. So Andy and Robin are very similar standard, I would say, and also rather linked by the fact that Robin is coached by Andy, and to further make this rather incestuous, Dawn is coached by her husband John Broom for the two running Brooms, and now recently Andy has started coaching John for the upcoming British Masters 5K. But we're very much talking about marathons today. So the Abingdon is a race in Oxfordshire in the UK, not far from London. It's pretty much a sort of traditional sort of club race. It won't be like a huge affair. You won't have an expo, you won't have a shakeout run, you won't have to stand in a queue for 2 hours to get started. You'll probably be able to park your car within sight, then jog over to the start, and a bit like a sort of a bigger version of a park run, I would say. So I think in that sense, a lot more sort of accessible race in terms of worrying about nerves and all that sort of stuff. I think Dawn and John are staying nearby in Buckingham. I think John's going to be doing the Buckingham park run, perhaps as you're watching this video in the morning. One I've also done, to see if you can get under 20 minutes like me. So look at their stats here. Robin has done the most amount of miles, just touched over 1,000 miles. Now he thinks in kilometres, so it's quite an easy conversion there. 1,000 miles is 1,600 kilometres, isn't it, basically? And Andy Raynor there, just slightly under 900 miles. Now it's interesting with Dawn. Now Dawn was a very, very good runner, and obviously still is as a vet, 60 now. And her PB dates back from London in 2006 at 2:56:02. Now clearly she's not in that sort of shape anymore, so her target this time is more around about the 3:30 mark. And Andy and Robin, well, they've recently come out of 71, 72 half marathons. It's kind of interesting with them because they got a very similar ability to what I was at the half marathon and the marathon. So I think they're going to be very close to my PB of 2:33:53. Both of them could well beat it. I think with Andy, he's maybe a bit suspect on the longer races. Never has really nailed one that great at the moment. His best time ever, his PB currently stands at in 2:40:44 in Newport 2 years ago, and he ran it in Abingdon last year when there was a bit of a thunderstorm and a gale, all sorts of horrible conditions, and he came out with that with a 2:44:02. So I think the training this year is looking a lot fitter, a lot more focused on the marathon. That's also rubbing off on Robin, who's also looking very, very good. So my predictions there pretty much align to the pace that I think they've been running their training at. So Andy, I think, has been doing his marathon pace at 5:55, and Robin a bit quicker at 5:50. I think that Robin may have slightly better conditions in Frankfurt, being a big city marathon. So I'm predicting a 2:34 for him. And for Andy, I'm predicting a 2:36. I think he could go better than that. But as I said, he's not perhaps the best distance for Andy. I think he struggles a bit with nutrition and the fact he's just a big guy. But he could well surprise us and come up with a time nearer to 2:30, considering some of the training he's been doing. And Dawn, I think she's going for a 3:30. And I'll be slightly pessimistic with her and say a 3:35, which will still be better than what she did last year, admittedly in similarly bad conditions at York with a 3:37. Now, I thought it might be useful to have a comparison with the recent analysis I've done on Chicago and Berlin. Let's first of all have a check-in with the featured runners from Chicago, Ben Filton and Eric Floberg. Well, I thought I was rather smug with my prediction because I was only 6 seconds out with Ben. Both of them did PBs. Ben pretty much did exactly what he was planning to do, just run a very marginal PB and a very well executed race. It was almost metronomic pacing and basically just came in exactly on the pace that he'd been training at. So a real textbook example of how to actually train for a marathon, in terms of do a lot of work at the 5:30 marathon pace you're hoping to run, and then go to the race and just basically run that for 26.2 miles. Floberg was very similar. He was holding the pace very well until the last couple of miles. We just drifted off. He was on the 2:31 for a lot of the race, just drifted off at the end, but he had a PB there by 7 seconds. So a very commendable performance by Eric. And yeah, I think he's PB'd in sort of his last 4 or 5 major attempts at the marathon, excluding the ones he's just been pacing or not taking it seriously. I heard he's got an entry now for New York. I don't think he's going to be racing that one at full steam. So very impressive there. And you can sort of see that the mileages were kind of similar. You say Ben and Eric did a bit more mileage than Andy. Dawn, well, we haven't got really too much of comparison with a 3:30 runner at the moment, but with the nearest perhaps is Mary. And Dawn did a lot more miles than Mary. And also the fact, I suppose, that Dawn being somewhat 15 plus years older is obviously not running quite as fast. But yeah, you can sort of see there that how well Mary did of the relatively low mileage she's doing. So if she can progress that, it'd be very interesting to see how she gets on. And I think Dawn's mileage is very impressive because she's obviously running that a lot slower pace than the other runners. You can see the average training pace there is only a 9:23, so that's over 2 minutes slower than Andy and Robin. Now, I think Andy in the past has been sort of quite a fast trainer. This time, he's actually sort of reined back his pace a bit. I think he's doing more of a polarized training where he's doing some easy runs as well as the marathon pace work. His average training pace there is quite similar to a lot of the other runners there. A bit faster than Matt Rees, but not by much, you wouldn't say. Robin and Matt are very similar. So you can kind of see that the average training pace is very much aligned to the aspirations of the runners. There's some nuances. You say that Andy perhaps is a bit quicker than Robin, looking for very similar times, but it also depends on where you're running. Having said that, their average elevation per mile is very similar. Dawn runs perhaps a lot on old railways, so maybe not quite the elevation gain there, but Andy and Robin, a very similar elevation gain there to Ioana, who's got his race on Sunday. So let's now have a look at Andy's training in more detail. Apologies for the rather busy spreadsheet, but I like to cram in all the detail here, and you can kind of study it at your own leisure. I think the first thing that strikes me about this is how well organised Andy was, and I think he's quite unique in all the runners at this sub-elite like level, that he only actually runs 5 days a week. He basically structures his day having Monday as an easy day. Tuesday was like a hard day. He started off doing a double threshold because he was coming out of like a 5k, 10k block. And then he really started his marathon block sort of middle of this sort of period towards the sort of middle of August. And then he also has Wednesday off, then does another hard session on Thursday. Again, it was either double threshold or going into longer marathon pace. Friday has his easy day. Saturday he does his sort of like his long run sort of marathon pace work. And then Sunday has off as well. So 5 days there of running and 2 rest days. So I think in that sense it's quite interesting, but he does some massive days. So what I've done here is break it down into more detail, because I think it's not just the longest run that Andy does each week, but also the fact that some days he's actually running effectively more than he does in his longest run, because he's doing some amazing double threshold sessions. So looking at the mileages here, I mean, we can see that the average came up at 68 miles a week with a median of 73. So it's a very good steady block, and the highest mileage week was only an 83. So very consistent. He just had 1 week there where it was only 24 miles, where he deliberately didn't run much because he was on a holiday. So that would have brought down the average a bit. But otherwise, extremely consistent training. And I don't think he had any sort of real issues. I think the only real issue he had is after this very impressive half marathon PB, 71.53 in the Fast Stars, where I think they gave him a bit of jip afterwards. But I think, as he said in his video, is that why would you want to swap a few days of soreness for a PB? And I think sometimes in a marathon block, if you come out with a half marathon PB or some other PB, then it's obviously an indication that your training is going very well. So let's have a look at the long runs here. Very consistently, the long runs. The longest run he did was 24 miles. And he's quite into doing marathon pace work within his long runs. He very rarely goes out and just does an easy long run, if ever, I think. So the key session here, he was doing 24 miles in total, doing 8k, 7k, 5k, 3k, 2k, 1k, with 1k floats between them. His marathon pace is around about just under 6 minutes, maybe a 5:55, 5:50. He runs a lot on sort of forest trails, so sometimes his marathon pace on his actual runs will be slower than perhaps they will be in the actual race, just by the fact he's moving on that more varied terrain. But yeah, incredibly impressive stuff. And then if you go back to the earlier in the block when he was doing double threshold stuff, so traditionally, like in the morning, he would do perhaps the slightly easier work there, 5x2k. And that was at a marathon pace of 6:05. I mean, this is like a marathon effort more, isn't it? As I said, it really depends on what you're doing. And in the afternoon, working a bit sort of quicker into sort of what they call lactate threshold 2. So that's probably more on the sort of the cusp between zone 3 and zone 4, whereas LT1 is probably around about your marathon pace. But I think Andy said when I chatted to him privately, he decided to not do double threshold towards the end of the block because he thought he could actually get out and do a longer session midweek without having the worry of having to do 2 sessions in a day. And what he was doing though was still running twice a day, but he was then doing a session in the morning here. For instance, this one there, 4x5k, classic sort of Nick Bester type sessions there, 4x5k averaging about 5:55, so bang on the marathon pace with 3 minutes sort of jog float recovery. And then in the afternoon he went out for an easy 5 miles. Often did that with some of his friends. So it's good to see that social side there. And then again on Thursday that week, 10x1k, so a bit quicker, 60 seconds. And then in the afternoon, going out easy again, doing 18 miles for that day and 23 miles on that day. And that would have been in addition to that week doing 22 miles, where he was averaging 6:33, and then included 60 minutes of that at marathon pace. And he was complaining that day was quite warm. So that's one of the problems, is it, training for an autumn marathon, that you do have to do a lot of your training during the warmer climbs. But yeah, I think all the runners I've featured in the last few editions, I've been struck by how disciplined they are. When we come to look onto Robin in a minute, it's very similar, hardly ever missing a day, very sort of similar training week to week, and yeah, just basically really focusing on this one event. The only race that Andy did was this half marathon when he did PB. I think he actually surprised himself there. I think Andy's also a bit sort of coy sometimes with longer distances in terms of what his actual aspirations are. And in his prediction video for his actual race, he didn't really actually say what time he was actually going for. But as I said, I think all the indications are that he's looking at a marathon pace just a bit under 6 minutes, which will bring him home somewhere around the 2:35 mark, I think, and then that would be a big PB compared to the 2:40. Conditions in Abingdon don't look great on Sunday morning, a bit rainy, bit of a sort of steady wind, not anywhere near as windy as last year, but it won't be warm, so Andy really doesn't like the warm weather, so that would be good. And perhaps a bit of drizzle will help to cool you down. I think the thing with drizzle is that you really just want to stay out of the rain, don't you, and make sure that you're really keeping yourself warm when you're not actually running. So I think the overall take from this is that he did an awful lot of work around target marathon pace, but also doing sessions where he's running a bit quicker than that. He wasn't then distracted by doing lots of park runs. In fact, Andy really doesn't really ever do park runs at all. He's very focused on Saturday morning and getting his long runs in. Obviously, people use park runs, part of a bit of a blowout, perhaps almost a bit of an easy day if they just take it easy, a bit more of a social thing. So it's very interesting to see now that John's coached by Andy, that John's still going to park runs and still filming them, and that's still very much part of his DNA and his culture. And yeah, he's not going to change that. I think the thing I've noticed so far that he's just doing a bit more focused race pace work in his sessions. There's one session here that he actually aborted. He was too tired. So although it's very consistent, it just goes to show that sometimes you really just have to sort of play it by ear. And if you're not feeling it, then yeah, by all means, rein it in, or just do an easy run, or just take a rest day, whatever is best for you. So I think Andy's going to be on a very good form. I think he's really honed into this marathon pace, and although I predicted only a 2:36 for him, I'm just slightly worried that he'll run out of steam towards the end of the race as he has before. But if he doesn't run out of steam, then he could well run a 2:32. But as I'm trying to estimate here what I actually think they would do as a bit of a betting man, so I think 2:36 would still be a massive PB and a real breakthrough for Andy. Let's just hope the weather conditions are good on the day and he hasn't picked up any last minute coughs and spluttering from all these kids and stuff. So hopefully he'll be under sort of a bit of a cloud for the last few days and really looking after himself. But yeah, you can see this week hasn't done an awful lot, 56 miles the week before, so hopefully he should be nice and fresh. I think Andy's very focused actually on getting to a race in peak condition. I think he's one of the best runners that on YouTube for doing that. So best of luck to him. Okay, so moving on to Robin Marbut's training here. Now, Robin doesn't really ever do any training videos of his own running. He's really just focusing on the YouTube for the shoe tubing, as it says. So perhaps his training will be largely unfamiliar. So I've had to sort of speak to him and look at his Strava to get a feel for it. And when you look at it, it's on the face of it quite similar to Andy's. Andy's is his coach, but the big difference, of course, is that Robin trains basically every day. He only had 3 weeks where he took a day off. 2 was planned because he had a race in 1 week. Another week we were just having a bit of a down week, and 1 day where he basically didn't feel well and just basically decided not to run. So literally 3 days off in 13 weeks. Now I've had to forecast what he's going to be doing for Saturday and Sunday. He told me what he was planned to do, so that's why those figures are in red. But you can see that he's obviously tapering. But on the face of it, you look at these long runs here and the longest days. Now the longest runs and the longest days are basically all the same, so I've just tried to see what I could see differences between Andy's training and Robin's training. And I think what I didn't see is any basically double threshold. So Andy, I think, really makes the most of his 5 days, whereas Robin has got basically 7 days to train, so can spread things out more, which means that he basically runs slightly more mileage. He's averaging there 77, but there's obviously this is in miles, of course, although Robin, being a European, will think in kilometers, so apologies. I tried to do some sort of conversions between miles and kilometers, but if you did conversions for everything, you'd literally be here doing massive amount of data, wouldn't you? But so let's look at these week mileages here, averaging 77, median of 81. So when the average and the median are very similar, it will suggest that it's a very consistent block, and the highest there was 96. So yeah, that was just a few weeks out, about months ago. Interestingly, neither Andy nor Robin went over the marathon distance in training. Both of their peak weeks, I think, were around about 23, 24, weren't they? Yeah. So in that sense, similar. But what I noticed with Robin, his long runs are always quite hard, I would say. That even when he talks about moderate, he's running here in the 6:21 pace, 6:25 pace averaging. And then his marathon pace, it's interesting because he's slightly quicker than he's been doing than Andy. But I think that may be because he's perhaps running in more tarmac conditions, maybe just able to go a bit faster, maybe just feels more comfortable at running at that pace. The only time he had a really bad run here, apart from the day he didn't run when he was ill, is that I think it was really hot conditions. He normally runs in the morning on a Sunday, and for some reason he couldn't make it in the morning, had to go out in the afternoon, and he tried to do some marathon pace and just basically didn't feel great. And although he tried to, it just really wasn't his day. So it just goes to show, as I said with Andy, that some days if you get that odd day when you're just not feeling it, it doesn't really matter, and you've got such consistent training here. Robbie is perhaps more traditional with these long runs, and perhaps he does do a lot more runs where it's more like an even pace there. You can see all the ones here which are even, but certainly not this is easy. I mean, when you consider that he's looking at a pace of 5:50 for marathon pace, or that's what he hopes to do, some of these runs here are only less than 30 seconds a mile slower. And I always think my long run sort of cruising pace would be about at least a minute per mile slower than my marathon pace. So I think this is real level 3 type stuff when he's going out and doing these long runs. Very good training, I think, when you're running at that sort of level, because I think that gives you a really massive aerobic boost without sort of really going into the edge. He also does quite a lot of work on the track here. And it was interesting here, a session towards the end of the block where he actually did what would have been his 5k PB, obviously not an official PB because it was in a race, but it wasn't even a flat out 5k. So we was doing a session here. He started off doing 3k, did that in 10:10, did a 200 jog, and then went straight into a 2k at 6:45. So the first 5k of those combined 3k, 200 jog and 2k worked out at 16:46. That's not really an amazingly stellar performance for somebody looking to run a sort of around the sort of 2:30 to 2:35 mark. But don't forget that wasn't an all-out effort, and I think he could well go under 16 minutes for 5k if he was to put some effort in there and actually doing one. So the only race that he did in the block was a half marathon PB, 72:48. Yeah, that was hugely impressive. And it just sort of shows that perhaps there's more to come. I think he did surprise himself a bit with that. So Robin was very consistent with his training. I think he's obviously getting this from Andy, but Tuesday and Thursday is always the interval session days, and Sunday always the long run. And just a very slight variation in that week when he did it on the Monday for some reason. But yeah, so a lot of work here, which I think is hovering around marathon pace, but nothing like, I would say, desperately quicker. So I think, again, very focused on the marathon distance, which I think is always good. I always think when people do training for a marathon, they always like to see very specific work, just working around marathon pace, a bit quicker. Nothing like too sort of like bold. I mean, some people trying to break PBs at every distance going during the block. I think Nick Bester is often guilty of that. Clearly, having said that, having run a 2:20, it works for him, but he's very keen on his 5Ks. Whereas I think Robin here, with just having the one race and no part runs or other distractions like that, very, very focused and still quite motivated to actually do the training. I think part of the reason he hasn't done so many YouTube videos is he's very focused on this running. And also, when you do a YouTube video, you have to go out and almost sacrifice a run, because you're not really doing a proper run, really. You're just sort of doing a few token strides, a bit of pseudo toe pass, looking at the shoe, taking it off, having to stop start, doing a few sort of strides and stuff like that. So you find that you do an hour's run and perhaps only covered about 4 miles, something like that. So yeah, I think in that sense he's been wanting to get this block in, and his PB is 2:38:30, and I think I predicted he's going to do a big PB. Not quite sure that you're quite going to manage the 5:50. I'm just being slightly pessimistic again, but 2:34. And interestingly, I'm forecasting quicker for Robin than for Andy, basically because I think Andy's just going to be slightly cautious with his marathon pace, whereas I think Robin will start off more on the game and see if he can hold a similar pace, I would say. That would be my impression. Overall training pace there, 7:22, so just a bit slower than Andy's, but very consistent week on week. It's always in the sort of low 7s, isn't it? It's a very similar training pace to what I did. I think when I did 2:33, I averaged about 7:10 with the dodgy GPSs of the day. But yeah, it's very similar when it all works out. I mean, you can see there's some impressive stuff, a 9:53k. But again, I think if you actually did a 3k race, I think you'd actually be a lot closer to 9 minutes, certainly under 9:30. So again, I think there's a very much element here of keeping this main sort of in the threshold type zone and not really over pushing it. So again, you can kind of peruse all these sessions to your heart's content, just to get a feel for what these people actually do. Here's one, 3 by 3 minutes. Averaging 5:25, that little squiggles saying averaging, going straight into then 3 by 2 minutes, the same, and then 3 by 1 minute, obviously doing a bit faster, all off 1 minute. So a lot of work there where you're mostly running hard, but sort of having a reasonable recovery, but not so much that you're having to sort of really fully recover. I mean, it's always the key with marathon training, isn't it? I think not to have too much of recovery, because you don't get any recovery in a marathon. If you're training for an 800 or 1500, then yeah, by all means take full recovery, but that's not the demands of this event for sure, is it? So yeah, great to see Robin's training, and really look forward to seeing how he gets on. I think it's been keen for me to analyse it. What do you actually make of it yourself, Robin? I mean, in hindsight, what would you have done differently? So here's Andy's and Robin's training side by side, and you perhaps would be hard pressed to think that Andy's actually coaching Robin in terms of they're not actually giving exact same sessions, although there was one here I saw 6 by 1600. I think Robin's paying to say that he doesn't operate in miles. I think if you're doing that on the track, you might as well do that extra 9.3 meters. But there, having said that, there's by 6 by 1 mile. Andy did in 5:36 and Robin did them in 5:22, but he was on a track, so I think that's going to make a difference. And difference there that Andy had 2 minute recovery, which was perhaps a bit generous, but then Robin just had 200 jogs. That's probably more going to be around about the minute compared to 2 minutes. But the long runs, Robin was doing more often. He was doing sort of like a straight through sort of zone 3 type tempo type steady run, just about 30 seconds a mile slower than marathon pace, where Andy was nearly always doing marathon pace within his long runs here. Some of the sessions, other than the one I just pointed out, so we've got one here, 15 by 1k, 6 by 2k. Don't think we quite see the volume with Robin we got here in terms of 1k reps. Have we got anything? Yeah, there's one here, 10 by 1k at 320k pace average. That's 5:10 mile pace. And then Andy did 15 by 1k. So definitely Andy has more volume in the sessions. I think he's very much trying to pile it on, though, isn't he? So that was off 60 seconds, and that was similar because he got 200 jog there. So very similar type session there. So you can see some similarities, but just the fact that you're getting the impression that and he's just doing a bit more volume, should we say. 4x3k at marathon pace, and then later in the week 8x1k. Don't necessarily see that one. What I did see with Robin, he was doing things here like 4x12 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes with no rest, but sort of like a progression. So 7-minute pace, 6:15, 5:25. So working for him fairly comfortably, working just below marathon pace, and then perhaps around about half marathon pace. But I didn't see that sort of session with Andy, so it's interesting how he chooses different sessions for his clients, as it were. I think that's also the thing, like if you looked at my training compared to what Matt's training, Matt Rees, the Welsh runner, he's not setting me anything like he does. He sets me basically 2 sessions a week, one a bit shorter intervals, one a bit longer, and that's about it. Sometimes he will sort of say on a steady run, sort of push it a bit rarely. The other day I did a tempo run where it's more like a progression. So I did 20 minutes sort of steady around about 7:15 pace, then I went into 15 minutes a bit quicker, then 10 minutes a bit quicker at the end. So I think I was sort of coming in from perhaps would have been about half marathon effort, finishing at around about 10k effort, something like that, all within about an hour. So that was quite good training, I thought. Anyway, so best of luck to Andy and Robin. So let's now move on to Dawn. I didn't do quite the level of detail with Dawn, but I was very focused on here on her mileage. I think also the fact that Dawn, being somewhat older, as John said, she can't do the level of intensity that the younger males can do. So, but what I would say here, again, very consistent. So look at these weeks here at the start, 70-mile weeks, 4 in a row. But also, it's taking 11 hours to do that. If you compare that to when Andy does a 70-mile week, he's only taking basically 3 hours less time. So you can kind of see that the mileage here for Dawn is probably worth a lot more. Now, I think what she did do interestingly, she sort of like went to quite a big period of mileage early on and kind of then eased it off a bit. I think she was perhaps having a few issues with her back and stuff. So, and then quite an aggressive taper here. Only 30 miles last week, only 32 in that week, but that was deliberately. And then also she had a very promising 5k race, 20:59. Which was considerably quicker than the 5k that she did at the Mid-Cheshire. I think she's a bit disappointed. That's the one I did as well. And interesting, that week she did a part run a bit quicker than straight after the East Cheshire race. And then up to a 10k, 44:48. So that wasn't perhaps a best run. So I think definitely a best run of late is this 5k. It's interesting that will that 5k sharpness from all this mileage and consistent training bear fruit in the marathon? That is perhaps the big question mark I would have of the training. So, and you notice here that the long runs, quite a lot of 20 miles exactly runs. I'm not quite sure how they managed to run exactly 20 miles. It's almost if they run 20 miles and she just sort of stopped in the middle of the road, or maybe they do it from home on the old railway at Penistone and they know exactly 10 miles one way and 10 miles back, or she deliberately works out in advance exactly how far it's going to be. But yeah, so the longest run that she did, which was 20 miles exactly, but she did basically 5 of those, and most of her long runs, I would say, were of the sort of easy-ish pace. There was a few runs here where she did a bit of marathon pace at the end. A lot of her favourite here doing the last 4 miles, either progressive or marathon pace. Now, marathon pace for Dawn appears to be around about 8-minute pace, which will bring her in nicely around about 3:30. So if she can do that, then I think she's on for a very good run. My worry is that has there been the amount of sustained marathon pace that you would really need? But I think, as John said, just trying to be slightly cautious here and managing the fact that it's a 61-year-old, and yeah, the PB was 2:56. It's interesting as well, 2:56, when I worked it out, that's pretty much the bang on the pace of the 5k, and I found that quite similar to me, my 18:38, quite a similar pace to my marathon pace back in the day, around about a 6-minute pace. I think I was just under with my marathon PB. So it's interesting that both us oldies are now running our 5Ks at our old marathon PB pace, which I think in some ways, if you find it, is quite respectable, and the fact you still can knock out those paces. But, you know, 5K is only, what, 3 and a bit miles, and we're talking 26 miles here, aren't we? So it's interesting with Dawn, as she's a school teacher, so they also had like ability to be a full-time athlete during the latter half of July and August, and they do like their travels, John and Dawn, and I think the latter part of July, early August, they were down in the Dorset area, and then moved over to sort of Norfolk area for the latter part of August with a few odd trips home just to keep the odd northern park runs doing. And you can all sort of work out where they are from whenever they do a park run each week. So yeah, during this sort of period when they're on holiday, they were experimenting with doing double threshold just 1 day a week, and that was really the only session that they did. So I've put one example down here of what she was actually doing. 5 by 6 minutes LT1, which is basically marathon pace or marathon pace target with a minute recovery. That was the one in the morning, I think, the slightly longer, the slightly slower, easier one. And then in the afternoon went into 10 by 3 minutes, here as an example. Just a bit quicker, maybe just sort of into more half marathon territory with a minute recovery, but like a long high volume session, isn't it? Where a session where you're mostly running rather than resting, and you're not really going too hard. So yeah, a lot of work there around marathon pace. So yeah, I think this training perhaps sort of shown it worked out really well for that 5k the other week, which was very impressive. Will she have enough in the tank though for the full marathon? I think it was obviously a very experienced marathon. I think she said she's done 20 plus marathons and maybe more than that. So yeah, very experienced marathon runner. I think Dawn pretty much know what sort of shape she's in. I think she said in the video she's probably going to go out a bit easier than 3:30, then see if she can work into it, which also makes me slightly nervous in terms of the aspirations. I don't think it's too common that you really will speed up into marathons. That's why I put my estimate at 3:35. I think what will happen is she'll probably start off around 3:35 and see if she can hold it, maybe with a slight sort of negative split if she can. But yeah, best of luck to Dawn. It'd be great to see that she can do well. I think it's a debut in the Welsh Masters as well. You would imagine that the Welsh are probably a weaker team than the English, aren't you? But I'm not quite sure how competitive these races are. I think there's an awful lot of kudos, isn't it, getting that vest, and I think John and me would be struggling to keep up with the best guys in our age group. Maybe when I get to 60, I'll have another go, but sometimes the 60s I feel even stronger than the 55. So, yeah, maybe that would be an aspiration for both of us to get in one day. But yeah, Dawn's very prolific in this area. So best of luck to Dawn. Also give a quick shout out to some other fellow YouTubers here. We've got Nick Gill from the NRG Runs channel. I think he's going for his first sub-3 marathon. So what's he saying in his biography here? Yeah, his marathon PB is currently 3:14, but he's got a 5k PB of 17 minutes and a 10k of 37:19 and a half of 1:23. So that all very much suggests that he's on for a sub-3 if he can keep it together. But obviously that first one is one that will need some work. So what is his training mileage? His average, including in sort of the current taper week, 50.8 miles, and what's his peak week here? Just under 70 miles, isn't it? So it all looks very consistent training. I think he did some marathon pace miles the other day where it was around about 6:40, 6:50. So there's a long run here. It's 2:52 long run, averaging 7:06 a mile. So that's very impressive. Probably my best run ever. Yeah, I mean, that's very encouraging. When was that? 14th of September. So not too recently. So hopefully he's managed to recover that. It's always a bit of a danger that you leave your best marathon in training. But yeah, that's been a good confidence booster and not much slower than his marathon pace. Oh, I see. Yes, did the Stevenage 10k course at half marathon pace in 38:14, and he did the Stevenage 5k course at marathon pace in 20:58. So yeah, I think that's all gearing up to a potential marathon around about 2:55. Probably best to primarily target that first sub-3, and if you feel good on the day, then see if they can get a bit more out of it. So yeah, best of luck, Nick. Another YouTuber we've got here, Matthew Locke. He's a very prolific racer. He often does the Bourton 10k. I think he was like 4th place, just missed the podium, running low 32 minutes. His PB marathon was last year in London when he did 2:29. I've seen a few runs where his marathon pace is around that. I'm not quite sure if he's quite in full form though. Just to do a last. Oh yeah, he's averaged 60 miles for the last 4 weeks, but he seemed to have been ramping up his mileage over the last couple of months. So I think he had a few niggles there. So he started off on quite a low base. Managed to get up to a week there where he did 86 miles there, but he does a lot of walking that he puts on his Strava as well, so I'm not sure that all that is 86 miles is running. I'm not quite sure if Matthew will be quite in sub 2:30 shape this time, but I suspect that he's going to be looking out for Andy FOD runner, and would he probably be a bit ahead of him? I think Andy's the sort of runner that's pretty best placed to keep Matthew in his sights, and it'd be interesting to see perhaps a slightly reduced amount of mileage for someone of his calibre. I think it's going to be quite fresh, and it's a course that he's locally, because he lives in Oxfordshire in Witney, so it's not going to be very far for him at all, so he won't have too far to travel. So in that sense, it's going to be a good run for him. So yeah, I probably say I didn't really get time to fully analyse the training, so best of luck. I think I would just say that, yeah, it looks like maybe won't be quite in PB shape this time, but I think he's going to have a solid run if he doesn't go out too quickly, but we'll see how we go. Very good runner for sure. So what do you make of this? What do you make of my Chicago predictions as well? I think I was quite good there. Will I be quite so good with these ones for Sunday in Abingdon and Ioana there? I've predicted a 2:33 for Ioana, 2:36 for Andy, 2:34 for Robin, and 3:35 for Dawn. So I think potential for all of those three runners there I featured in this video to do better than my prediction. Let's just not hope for no disasters this time. Let's just hope the weather plays good and they all get to get on the line and have a good race. Anyway, so how you found this? Like and subscribe to that, and see you next one then. Bye.